Good afternoon, and welcome to Philadelphia Magazine's ThinkFest 2020. I'm Tom McGrath, editor of Philadelphia, and I want to thank you for tuning into this session about the future of Philadelphia's public schools, featuring Dr. William Hite, superintendent of the school district, and Nydia Han from 6ABC. 2020 is for sure a year that none of us will ever forget. That's why we at Philly Mag thought it was important to produce this virtual edition of ThinkFest as a way of talking about not only COVID-19, but all of the issues underlying the protests from the last couple of weeks. Before we get to our conversation, I'd like to say thanks to the sponsors who've helped make this event possible, including our presenting sponsor, Bank of America, as well as St. Joseph's University, T0 Group, and Paperboy Media Group. And now here's a message from Jim Dever, Philadelphia Market President for Bank of America.
Thank you, Tom. Although we cannot be together in person, it is so important that we remain connected, and I'm delighted to join you virtually to kick off Philadelphia Magazine's annual ThinkFest. Like many of you, I look forward to this forum each year when we get to hear candid conversations and presentations from thought leaders in our community. I commend Philadelphia Magazine for having the foresight to pivot to a virtual event this year, and we are delighted to have the opportunity to once again participate as presenting sponsor. I look forward to hearing thoughts and ideas from today's prominent speakers, like Dr. William Hite, who will share their views on the impact of the global pandemic, as well as the urgent cry for racial justice that is spreading through communities across the United States. We are at a critical time in our nation's history. Never has it been so important to listen to each other, engage in thoughtful dialogue, and work together to help shape our country for future generations. Our CEO, Brian Moynihan, just committed $1 billion over 4 years to help communities address growing economic and social inequality. This means providing help where it is needed most: healthcare, housing, jobs, and supporting small businesses. Along with my teammates here in Greater Philadelphia, we remain committed to the important work that lies before us. I look forward to engaging in the dialogue that begins this week, but will certainly continue well beyond. Thank you.
We'll be hosting these ThinkFest conversations all week long at noon and 4 p.m. I hope you can join us for all of them. In today's conversation, Nydia Han will interview Dr. Hite for about 30 minutes, then we'll have about 15 minutes of audience questions. Thanks again for tuning in. Enjoy the conversation.
Thanks, Tom, and a big thanks to Philly Mag for hosting ThinkFest virtually, giving us this space to connect and discuss these really critical issues. Now, Dr. Hite has been the superintendent of the Philadelphia School District for 8 years now, since the fall of 2012. You are charged with the education of 134,000 in 226 schools. Thanks so much for joining us this afternoon.
Nydia, it's a pleasure to be with you. And I also want to thank Philly Mag for putting on ThinkFest, albeit virtually, which is, it seems, the new world we're in here in the past several months.
It certainly is, and it seems like we better get used to it. So we want to talk about the school district's plans for the fall in light of COVID-19, but I want to first talk about the systemic racism that continues to take a tragic toll on our community. I know that you have joined at least 2 marches to demand equity and justice. Tell me on a personal level, what was going through your mind just this past weekend as you marched from the Octavius Catto statue to the African American Museum on Arch Street?
Yeah, I mean, I think the things that are really important to me as, first, a Black man who happens to be a father, a grandfather, and also an educator that's responsible for educating children in the city. And as I was going from the Octavius Catto statue to the African American Museum, I was just thinking about all of the opportunities that we now have to hopefully, once and for all, deal with a justice system that applies justice differently based on the color of one's skin, or the racism that we still have to experience, or the inhumane brutality against African American or people of color, men and women, after we all had the opportunity to watch in horror the death of George Floyd. And so as I was thinking about on that walk from the Caro statue to the African American Museum, hopefully this time we will have an opportunity to make real and lasting changes, Nydia, so that my 8-year-old grandson does not have to relive this through his lifetime.
Tell me about the conversations that you do have within your family with your 2 grown daughters and your 8-year-old grandson.
Yeah, I mean, it's a struggle, and I had to, as I indicated before, part of this was struggling through my own emotions and understanding the anguish and anxiety of individuals, particularly as they got to all watch this most recent death of George Floyd and many others, and far too many others, and so my children, my grown daughters, they still are asking the question, why are we still dealing with this? And then we've talked about this for so many years. In fact, packed up and both jumped in the car. One lives in Northern Virginia, one lives in the Hampton Roads area, but they both headed to DC just to participate on Black Lives Matter Plaza, because they just felt it was so critically important. But the conversations that we have, and from a personal experience, my 2 daughters, their grandfather he was the principal of the school that closed back in the 1960s, that was in Prince Edward County, and their mother and their family actually had to move out of the county because that school district refused to integrate. And so it was a part of Brown v. Board of Education. But so they have that background, and so they understand the significant impact of what's happening. But as I indicated before, the opportunity here is when you see the diversity of the crowds who are out, when you see everyone calling for justice, not just here in Philadelphia, but across the nation and across the world for that matter. And so we have a real opportunity now to hopefully change and deal with racism directly, call it out and deal with it, have the hard conversations about that as a school district and as humans who come from very different places. And so that's what we are doing here at the school district. And we look forward to continuing to do our part on educating our young people about how to have that level of discourse. And as adults, we also have to model that discourse. And so, which means that we may not always agree, we may be coming from different places, but it's really important for us to model the type of discourse we want to see our students and our young people engage in.
Hundreds of people marched down Broad Street demanding bias screening for newly hired educators. I know you met them on the steps of the Philadelphia School District. You called for educators to stand up against institutional racism. Tell me exactly what that means to you and what you think of this call for bias screening for newly hired educators.
Yeah, I mean, so first on the bias screening for newly hired educators, I think we need it for educators just in general. So not just the new hires, but individuals who are in our classrooms right now. I'm in complete support of that. And that's going to be a part of our plan moving forward, as well as we had already started training our senior leadership around equity and how we think about equity as a school district and how we make decisions based on equity. The board has talked about a series of goals that has equity at the center of that. So equity is also going to be moving forward, as well as diversity and having a curriculum that is more culturally competent so that young people see themselves within that curriculum. So that is something that we do plan to do moving forward. And it was really important. Those individuals walking down Broad Street are the individuals who lead our schools. And so they're colleagues, they're administrators, they are educators, and they are also experiencing angst and anxiety. And I wanted them to know that I was also experiencing that very same thing. And it's okay to call it out. It's okay to be agitated and annoyed, but we also have to think about what do we do as adults And what do we do in our respective capacities to make sure that under no circumstances can we tolerate racism in our schools, racism as it relates to how individuals think about our children, the injustices that exist. And I talked about the institutionalized racism, and I have to say that one of the principles in the fair funding lawsuit is that districts like ours are funded differently than districts that have more means. And so when you have a funding system that actually directs money not based on the children that are served, but then based on other types of things, and you hold that system harmless for year after year after year. And so that's an inequitable funding system. And it is not based on the children we serve or how many individuals need to learn English or have special needs. And so that to me is a component of institutionalized racism, because then you're saying some individuals matter more than others, and you have a funding system that actually supports that. And so that's just one example. And I could use other examples are access to healthcare, access to nutrition, access to services, and all of those things can't be distinguished or disproportionate based on large populations where there are concentrations of individuals who are dealing with the circumstances associated with poverty.
For people who aren't familiar with that fair funding lawsuit, talk a little bit more about how the current funding system disadvantages Black and brown students.
Yeah, I mean, it is because it's not based on the children we serve. And most funding systems in other states where I've worked, that's in Virginia, in Georgia, even in Maryland, the funds were actually distributed based on the numbers of children who are served and their conditions or their circumstances that actually needed to be addressed. And so if there were large concentrations of students that were in poverty, there were large concentrations of students who were learning English, or large concentrations of students who had a special need, then there were factors that were added on so that those children received more. That is not the case here in Pennsylvania. The funding system is based on a system that was put into place some 3 decades ago, and that system is just based on the numbers of students that are in the system. And then there's a whole harmless provision that is added to that system. And that whole harmless provision allows districts who have lost children in some respects to maintain a level of funding, which means that they actually benefit from the fact that they have fewer students. And so it is a system where monies are not following students, they are following, they are based on decisions that were made several years ago based on the populations in those districts. And that is inherently unfair. In fact, it's been recognized, unfortunately, with the dubious distinction of being the most inequitable funding system in the country. And so it was rated dead last in terms of rich jurisdictions and poorer jurisdictions and the funding associated with that.
I want to talk a little bit more about funding later on, but going back to curriculum, how do you think the Philadelphia School District is doing currently in terms of really teaching children comprehensively and deeply about African American history and Asian American history and the history of other communities of color and marginalized communities? And what do you see as concrete steps to really improve that curriculum?
Yeah, so I think we're doing a great job with the African American history curriculum, and the reason I say that is because as a result of a march that happened in 1967, where Black students walked out and walked out in protest because they wanted to make sure they were treated fairly and with respect to the curriculum. And as a result of that, there was the beginning of an African American history curriculum. And Philadelphia was the first district in the country that made that a graduation requirement, and it is still a graduation requirement to this day. And children take it in the 10th grade. Every single student must take it in order to graduate. But to your question, we haven't done as well with all of the other cultures that we serve. And there's some 150 languages spoken by young people who attend our school district. And we have to make sure that the curriculum is not just focused on just African American history, but it needs to be focused on the cultures that we serve. And those are many different cultures. And we are actually redoing our curriculum now. We're in the process of that right now to make it a more culturally competent and relevant curriculum so that our young people, regardless of where they are, see themselves as a part of their educational experience here in Philadelphia.
As an Asian American mom in Philadelphia, I appreciate that continued effort. So
Absolutely.
Thank you, Dr. Hite. I know you've made diversity, equity, and inclusion your core mission and really what you're trying to do within the district. So we appreciate your efforts. I want to move also to COVID-19 and talking about how with COVID-19, the pandemic, and also with systemic racism and the unrest that we're seeing in our city, how can students and families cope? What resources is the district providing?
Yeah, so we've actually established multiple resources, and we did this because we were hearing from individuals firsthand. And so we have resources that will help individuals navigate the technology that we've been distributing. We have resources for individuals to connect with services. We also have resources that help individuals manage through some fear and anxiety and frustration. And it's called the Philly Hope Line. And that is a line that individuals can call on a daily basis from noon to 9 p.m. and from noon to 4 p.m. on weekends and holidays. It is staffed by clinicians, and those individuals are there to actually help individuals talk through things in which they're experiencing. And if there's a family who has children in the school district of Philadelphia, they can call that line. In addition to that, we've done a lot of virtual types of town halls and meetings, and those virtual town halls are to hear from our families, our caretakers and guardians, so that we are finding out what they still feel like they need in order to help their children through this time period.
I'm sorry.
I was going to say, in addition to that, we've had to do a lot of work as we prepare for a virtual environment of training educators on the use of the technology and how to teach and learn in this new world, if you will.
So speaking of that, talk about the fall. I mean, it's the elephant in the room, right? Everyone is wondering what to expect this fall.
Yeah, so we actually are working right now, and we're working based upon a set of principles. And one principle is to return children to school in the fall. And so that's one of the principles. Another principle, though, is that we want to make sure they're safe and that we are guided by all of the entities that are providing critical health advice, critical safety advice, like the CDC, the health department. We're working with the policy lab at CHOP. We have multiple individuals coming together to work these plans through. In addition to that, there are quite a few considerations and barriers, if you will. And some of those considerations and barriers are, if in fact we have to have physical distance, what does that mean for schools that are overcrowded right now? If individuals, both families or staff members, have pre-existing conditions that put them into a vulnerable category, what do we do with those individuals? And so there are a lot of considerations that we also have to make. So we will have a plan and timeline that is going to be presented June 15th, and we're going to present that to the public, and we're going to have a series of meetings as a result of that, and then present a more specific focused timeline on July 15th for the beginning of the school year. But we're looking at 3 scenarios, and I've talked about these a lot. And those scenarios are returning everyone, and that's our goal. And the other scenario is remaining in a digital environment. And then the third scenario is a hybrid of those two things. And we think, and one thing that I've been saying here recently is that it's impossible with a district at a district of our size to use just one of those scenarios and apply it across the various schools, the many different communities, in a different set of contexts that we will likely have. And so leaning towards the hybrid model, and which is a combination, and that's going to be guided by what is needed in those schools and in those communities. But also say to any individual who is worried that we are going to be sending out a survey this week, as a matter of fact. And that survey is going to ask parents, ask staff members, ask students about what needs to be in place in order for them to feel safe to return to school in the fall.
Can you be a little more specific about what that hybrid might look like? Are we talking AM, PM? Are we talking about different days of the week for different school, for different student groups?
Yeah, I mean, so all of those are a part of the consideration. And the minute I say one thing, then people go with that one thing. And so I'd hope not to be specific, but that will be more of the plan that we release in the 15th. But it's a consideration of all of those things. It is, if in fact we're going to be guided by requirements for physical distancing. And we already know that we have schools that are at 173% capacity. So it's almost impossible to distance individuals. And so we'd have to think about what do we do in terms of adjusting schedules to make sure that we can have the appropriate distancing requirements or barrier requirements in terms of who wears a mask, who wears a face shield, who can come on what days. Do we do an AM, PM? All of those things will be a part of the consideration. And we have to do, naturally, a lot of cost analysis with that. And then, Nydia, there are some 70,000 children in the city of Philadelphia, district, charter, and parochial, who take SEPTA to and from school every day. So that's another part of the consideration that we have to plan for as a part of how we're thinking about school and reopening.
There are so many considerations. Another big issue with virtual learning is the possibility of further widening the digital divide. So for students whose families do not have devices, laptops or desktops, or high-speed internet access, I know that you've sort of resolved the first issue. Can you talk about that, and then also talk about what you're doing for internet access for all students?
Yeah, we resolved the first issue because the Board of Education actually took a vote to allow us to purchase 40,000 Chromebooks. And those Chromebooks were then matched to the Chromebooks the devices we already had in schools. And we have distributed some 84,000 pieces of technology to our families. It's any child who's in the school district that says they need one. So we solved that problem.
And that's one device per student, not per household, correct?
That's one device per student, not per household, because as a mom yourself and with children of varying ages, they're working on different things. And so it's not appropriate for them to share something because they may need to be on at the same time. However, then that brings us to the second problem. And the second problem is making sure that all of our families have access to the information that's out there. And that access comes in the form of internet access, or having a mobile hotspot, or something where they're able to connect to the resources that are available. Many of our families took advantage of the Internet Essentials. We had about 5,000 families that, for whatever reason, that option did not work for them. We were able to provide 2,500 of those families with mobile hotspots, or those are Wi-Fi devices. And we hope to get a grant to actually help support the other 2,500. But it's another problem, though, that we have to continuously work on to resolve, because Internet Essentials, as you may know, the first 2 months are at no charge. Then you're charged $10 a month for that service. And for many of our families who were disproportionately impacted by a lot of the closures and the businesses and maybe out of work, that may become really difficult for our families. So we are anticipating that number who may not have access to internet to increase. And we're trying to think of a better solution for that problem than just annually having to purchase mobile hotspots, because those are annual purchases and they cost as much as the Chromebooks cost.
Right, it's $185 a month, right?
A year.
It's
for 12 months, but
right.
12 months is over, then you have to buy a new one. And so we have to think of a solution for that problem. And I'm not suggesting that is Comcast's problem to resolve, but I just think we have to think through this from the school district's perspective, City of Philadelphia, the businesses, the business community, and anyone else who is willing to help us come up with a technological solution to this issue, because that will be the next equity issue, because if you don't have access to that, then you cannot take advantage of the resources that we've provided.
I know the economic recession resulting from the COVID-19 pandemic is significantly impacting the school district of Philadelphia. So next year, you guys are projecting a $30 million funding shortfall. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so we were projecting a $30 million revenue shortfall, and we had an advocacy campaign, and thank goodness the state approved a budget that kept funding at its current level. And that was one of our advocacy asks, that if you can just maintain funding at the current year level, we weren't asking for anything more, and whatever funding that the state received through the CARES stimulus funds that were targeted to education, make sure as much of that flows to education as possible. And so thanks to the Harrisburg has come through, and they are maintaining level funding for K-12 education, and they're going to push all of the money that was designed for the stimulus as it relates to education to school districts. And so that actually helps solve that problem for us. And so it doesn't create the immediate problem in the short term, but we still have a significant budget gap in the long term. And that budget gap will grow to about $500 million over the next 3 years. And so we have to begin working now to resolve that issue.
We were talking earlier, parent to parent, about some of the silver linings out of the pandemic, forcing our students and our families and our districts to be more flexible, to be more nimble, to be innovative. Talk to me about some of the lessons learned and some of the silver linings you see.
Yeah, Nydia, that's the beauty of all of this. I mean, and I've talked a lot about, like, out of every crisis becomes an opportunity to rethink something that has just happened because of the institutional history and knowledge. And if you think about education, it hasn't changed for 200 years. I mean, so the classrooms by and large look very similar to the classrooms you and I attended, and you're much younger than me, but but it looks similar to the classrooms we attended. And here's an opportunity for us to rethink what education looks like. And so we can actually approach it so that it's not specifically place-based and time-based, but instead it is project-based, it's based on inquiry, it's based on young people having access to information that doesn't necessarily require the direction of someone in front of the class who's saying, go here or go there. But it also exposes children in certain parts of the city. And so part of that place-based strategy forced us, in many cases, to think about staffing in a certain way. So here's an example. If, in fact, schools wanted to have an advanced placement class, I'll use that as an example, then there was a requirement to have at least 15 children in order to have that advanced placement class, because you had to justify that FTE or that position. And so you needed at least 15 students to do that. But in many of our schools, there may be 2 or 3 students who are interested in an advanced placement class. And because there are not 12 other individuals in those schools, then those young people then lose the opportunity to have an advanced placement class. Now, you can live in a part of the city and enroll in an advanced placement class that may be offered in a different school. And that's allowed us to erase some of the place-based decisions that have historically been made around how we can provide access to more students. So now you can live in one part of the city, and if you're interested in AP Calculus, then you can enroll in the AP Calculus class. Although it may be in another part of the city, the technology, the ability to access the internet and the information gives us the ability to do that. And we have to think about that throughout. And so now multiple children could have access to the best science teacher or the best math teacher. And these are ways that we could think very differently about how then education occurs.
In some ways, our world got smaller and we're more connected than ever before. I really appreciate that silver lining. Here's a question coming to us from one of our audience members. How do you see standardized testing contributing to racial inequality in the classroom?
Yeah, I mean, I think that has always contributed to inequality, and because it doesn't take into account where children start and who has had access to what. And so I use the example of pre-K, and we know that pre-K actually makes a difference for young people throughout their educational experience. But with many families, they could actually provide the type of pre-K experience just from what they know as a parent. Then there are other parts of the community that cannot do that, but they still do not have a pre-K option to send their child to. And that child is at a distinct disadvantage. And then the standardized test comes in 3-4 years later, measures where background knowledge, measures vocabulary, measures comprehension, and it doesn't take into account those differences. And so that's where the inequality part of this came in. And I think that the way we have to think about assessments is based on where every child is relative to where every child should be, not as it relates to like what we think should happen based on like the whole group of young people. So which means you're at the 8th grade, you should be here. It's just when we should ask instead, where did you start? Where do we need you to go, and how do we provide the support to you in order to get there? And so I do think the standardized tests were taken to an extreme, and they were taken to an extreme in a variety of ways. One, they were offered every year, which then becomes a gigantic time-consuming activity that takes away from a lot of other things. But then they're used to almost evaluative, and they were used from the perspective of an evaluative standpoint based on what our children know, what they don't know. And I'm not suggesting we should not have an assessment. We should. But the assessment should be ongoing. It should be a part of what every professional sees happening with their young people. And we should have some sort of indicator based on if a child is in this grade and we have these standards in place, you must have a way to measure that. It just doesn't need to be every year and take 3 or 4 weeks to do in the spring because it's testing time.
And testing on a higher level too, you can prep for, you can memorize for, you can pay to get tutored for. And so I think that's where a lot of the inequity comes in as well.
It's no question. It's like the pre-K example. I mean, it is those with means will actually, I mean, we know how to work the system, and those with means actually can work that system. Those without then are at then they're at the mercy of all of the inequities. And those inequities may have been, I didn't have time to study, or that there was significant trauma in my household or in my community, or I don't have a parent here, or I didn't have the technology or the access to the internet, or I don't have those resources. So that's where the inequities come in as it relates to those assessments.
So we have another question from an audience member. How are students with disabilities being supported equitably during this time of distance learning?
Yeah, I mean, that's been tough. I mean, and I'll be the first person to say that part of when you have to close and when there's a requirement so that you have to monitor contact, the children who have been impacted the most, those who are the most vulnerable. And those are young people that need face-to-face interaction. They need individuals, they need to see their individuals. In some cases, individuals need to provide physical therapy or those types of things. And if that can't be done, those young people will be impacted in a very different way. The way that we are thinking about it is we've targeted more resources and supports to those populations. However, that still is not a sufficient replacement for person-to-person instruction. And so about this moving forward, those are the populations we're paying the most attention to when we come back to some form of normalcy, because we know that it's those populations who have lost the most. And while we have all of these resources in place, the virtual environment is just not the same. It's not sufficient. And we're trying to do the best we can through a set of challenging circumstances, but it is not a sufficient replacement for that person-to-person interaction between a student and their teacher.
So you are making students with disabilities the priority when it comes to returning to school in some semblance of normalcy in the fall.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, not just in the fall, this summer. So we're starting with those young people this summer and looking at our extended school year program, what that program will entail. We think that we can learn a lot from that program that can inform the programs when we come back in the fall.
Terrific. We have so many questions. Here's another one. The school district offers so many services to the families and students you serve. This pandemic has shown a spotlight on the many layers of challenges the communities face. Share a little about access to food and the steps the district has put in place since school closure to support families during these times.
Yeah, I mean, it's been significant. I mean, and I can't say enough about our school food service group, our operations team, our school safety officers. They have distributed some 2.7 million meals already. I mean, and so those are the meals that have been distributed. We're going to continue to distribute those once a week, and individuals can pick up 5 breakfast meals and 5 lunch meals when they pick up those meals on Thursdays from 9 to noon. And we're going to continue that through the summer. And so we actually are going to continue to work to provide that service because it was so critically important that individuals still had access to those those meals during this period of time. In addition, I talked about the hotline and all of the helplines. We have counseling available. We have college or career counseling available for our graduating seniors and individuals to help them with FAFSA certifications and making sure they have all of their documents in place. Or if they're looking for work, then individuals are available to help them. We have a senior hotline just for our seniors. We have individuals who are tutoring based on the work that we're asking individuals to do. And then once again, we have things available for our families. And we have the virtual town halls. I do a Facebook Live every Wednesday at 3 p.m. I have a radio show every other Saturday. And we're just trying to provide as much information as we possibly can about the resources that we want to make sure individuals take advantage of here in the school district.
And I know all those resources are online, but I want to give the Hope line just because it's easy for people to remember. It's 1-833-PHL-HOPE. right? One
That's correct.
833 PHL Hope. So people can call that line. And I know you said the hours are noon to, can you repeat the hours one more time?
Noon to 9 p.m., Mondays through Fridays. And it is noon to 4 p.m. on weekends and holidays. And it is open, it is manned, and they are receiving lots of calls. And they are clinicians who are counselors, and they can work with families and children to make sure that we are helping them deal with their anxiety and anguish as we all experience something that we haven't experienced before.
And here's another question. Many Philadelphia families depend on school for childcare. If there are different school schedules in which children don't go to school some days, does the city have a plan for childcare?
Yeah, so that's all part of the consideration. That's an excellent question. And those are the types of questions that we're going to be seeking responses to those types of questions when we send out a survey. So stay tuned for that and just make sure. And that's one of the reasons that it's a part of the consideration. And we have to think about the grades as it relates to who does what, right? So we may have more options with older children to that point, because perhaps they can take care of themselves, whereas elementary school children, if we have to go on some sort of staggered schedule, it may need to be something like an AM PM versus a Monday, Tuesday. And so we have to give all of those considerations ample analysis to make sure that we are not negatively impacting other individuals as we try to work children back to school.
And how are school staff being prepared to help students deal with returning to school after being away for so long? Students are going to need a lot of support, getting used to structures and being in school again.
Yeah, I mean, I think when we return, and one of the things that we've talked about is that when we return, we need to first take care of the adults who are there. And I'm talking about teachers always come back before children come back, and we have to spend that time making sure that we are also doing some self-care, actually having individuals talk about the trauma that they've experienced, and already know just when individuals will see each other, it's going to create, they're going to remember some individuals that may have been lost during the COVID-19 crisis, and they're going to remember other types of traumatic experiences. So as adults, we're going to do some self-care first, and then when the children come back, we're going to have to do the exact same thing with them. And we're going to have to do that first. Then we can get into the instruction and all those other things, but we're going to have a chance to build community, to talk through emotions and feelings, to make sure individuals taking heed to the emotions and feelings that individuals have been dealing with. And lots of people have been lost through the COVID-19 crisis. And individuals haven't been able to grieve in some cases with that, because they haven't been able to come together as groups. And all of that is we are planning for all of those types of things when individuals return to school. And once one of my colleagues talked about this, you have to Maslow before you can bloom. We have to take care of people's most basic emotional needs, and then we will begin to build from that and begin working with our young people to ensure that they are okay to begin the lessons in math and reading and science and social studies and all of those other things.
Dr. Hite, we are getting so many questions. So many people are wanting to talk to you. We only have 2 minutes left. Do you have anything that you want to tell people before we go?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to once again acknowledge my deep respect and understanding for the anguish that individuals are feeling, particularly during this period of time. And as I sent out a letter to staff, and as I sent out a letter to our families, well, one, I want to thank them, and I want to thank them for what they've been dealing with over the past several weeks and months. And I want them to know that as a school district, we're going to do our part to make sure that we are, as I indicated before, addressing the inequities that exist in our system, dealing with racism, but more importantly, as children return in the fall, we're going to ensure that children are returning to buildings that are safe, that are set up, to make sure that we're following CDC and other health.
Okay, Dr. Hite, I'm so sorry that we keep losing you. I think he's losing power at the district. This is the problem that we have with a lot of these virtual conversations, right? But Dr. Hite does do a Facebook Live every Wednesday. So for those of you who had more questions and great questions that we couldn't get to, please log on to Dr. Hite's Facebook Live. We want to thank once again Philly Mag for hosting ThinkFest 2020 virtually. The conversation continues at 4 p.m. today and then throughout the week at noon at 4 p.m. The conversation at 4 today is the future of Philly public health. So we hope that you will tune in. Thanks so much again, everybody. Stay safe and healthy out there. We are with you and thinking about you as we continue collectively to tackle these critical issues for our community. Have a good afternoon.